Once again, back for a second showing. We've got Bruce Scovill. And Bruce, of course, is going to give us the second half of Cowboys and Indians. Now, you going to talk more about the Cowboys or more about the Indians today?
Well, I'm going to try not to cuss at the technology first.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, bleep, bleep. Okay. Bleep you.
It's kind of a part two thing. A reminder that, there were lots of different Sioux Indians. And within the Sioux Indians, you had like the Hunkapapa, for example. But even within that tribe of the Sioux, there were many different bands and clans. And no chief spoke for all of them. Not at all, and the chiefs knew it. And so when a Indian chief signed a treaty, he was not signing for everybody. He wasn't even signing for his own tribe. He was typically signing for his family. And he knew that, and the whites never seemed to grasp that. So no matter, they have the Fort Laramie Treaty, and they have 100 famous Indians we've all heard of. That doesn't mean those Indians are signing for others. Even Sitting Bull was not speaking for all of the Indians. And this is a major problem that never really is never really fully understood. You have, of course, the Mexicans have been there for generations and generations. And so the southwestern part of the United States, which will be acquired completely in 48 with the war with Mexico. And so you still have a lot of strong Spanish culture out in parts of California and the Southwest and parts of Texas, of course. Loggers and trappers, they never get much time in books. I doubt we see I don't know if Ken Burns will do one on loggers and trappers. Trappers, we have a few movies and a few books, but not much on the mining, or not much on the logging industry. There's an old book I read many years ago called Mills and Markets, and it was about the early logging going on even during the American Revolution, that you just don't hear much about around what we would have called Portland and that Seattle area. And then you have a few American settlers, not too many, really, maybe 10 or 20,000 scattered throughout, mostly in California. And we know the Donner Party was one of the last groups that go before gold is discovered. If they go a year later, the Donner Party is not a part of history. They were simply settlers moving out. But they preceded the gold rush and ran into all those problems. And then you have a small number of Asians and Chinese specifically, and those numbers will grow. Once gold is discovered, the numbers of Chinese will increase as there's going to be a call for workers. There's also things happening in China, a massive, nasty, ugly war going on in China, a civil war, and that will drive a lot of Chinese to leave and seek a better life outside of their country. This is going to go at its own pace. Let me see if I can go back here. So gold was discovered in 1848. Certainly word gets back to the rest of the world a few months later. And 1849, of course, is when we have the massive rush to get to the gold fields. Most of the people go by ship. Again, we always hear about the people that are crossing by land, but most of the people seeking gold from around the world, not just from the eastern part of the United States, will go by ship. The photograph you see below is of San Francisco Bay. I won't try to tell you specifically what you're looking at, but I think the tall buildings would be around here, and back in here would be the Golden Gate Bridge way back there. Obviously, it's not there yet. The problem, what was happening, and the reason why you have this, what looks to be like a traffic jam, was because those ships would come in, and many of the crew would decide they wanted to head to the gold fields. And so the next morning, if you will, the ship captain wakes up and his crew is gone. I don't have numbers, and it may have been some captains said, I'm going too. But you certainly... And this then creates a problem because these ships can't be used in other parts of the world, or some company that might be involved that owns them, all of a sudden now they can't use them. So this was a real problem. And it's also at this time in which the famous term being shanghaied comes along, because these ship captains would need crew members, and so they would often find some people who had been at the bars a little too late that night, truly being stereotypically clubbed or captured and taken aboard ship, and the next morning they're many miles out to the Pacific Ocean and kind of find themselves impressed or kidnapped. But the term to be shanghaied is associated with that. There you go, between 48 and 1850, 100,000 people immigrate to California, which of course meant that they very quickly met the threshold for statehood. And so when they applied for statehood, of course, this was a time in which, right before the Civil War, you've got an equal number of slave states and free states, and California is going to upend that balance, especially even if you carried the 3630 line, the Missouri Compromise line. It cuts California in half. And the people of California did not want slaves. They did not want slavery. They oppose it for a multitude of reasons. But because California had so much gold, both the South and the Northern politicians realized they have to bring it in as a state. They have to possess that gold for the betterment of the country. And so it created some serious problems for us, or at least for this class, without getting into the politics of the various compromises. There also, this rush led now a new friction, new confrontation between the Reds and the Whites, the people that were crossing the country to get to California, and now the Native Americans who live in California. And so we see at about this time the initial attempt to appropriate money for reservations. The decision to put Indians on reservations becomes kind of factual now. It's going to be a serious attempt at this. I'd be happy to. I don't know about feedback. So, what? Okay. Some things to keep in mind. Also then, in the 1850s, I have up here an ineffective executive. In other words, what we had were a series of presidents who just weren't, for various reasons, not because they themselves weren't capable of doing it, they just had a very weak number of presidents. Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan. And so we lack leadership in the 1850s, generally speaking. The legislature is deadlocked. We have kind of a very real balance in the House and the Senate between slave and anti-slave politicians. Violence, of course, was not uncommon. The judiciary, so the third branch of the government, the judiciary, is run, and that is not Chief Justice Cheney. That should be Chief Justice Taney. Sorry, but Chief Justice Taney was from Maryland, and he had grown up with slaves. And so now we have a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who is no longer a slave owner, but certainly has grown up in a world of slavery and is somewhat sympathetic, as we saw in the Dred Scott case at that time. The economy, we have our next depression, the business cycle, if you will. I'm not a business person, but about every 20 years, it used to be, we had economic downturns. 37 was, the Panic of 1837 was really bad. The Panic of 1857 is now another economic downturn. So you have a lot of political friction. You've got the issue of slavery. And on top of that, then we have a really bad economy. And I put the SS Central America, which is going to be caught up in a hurricane off the coast of South Carolina and will sink loaded with gold coming from California. It had come up from we don't have the canal yet, so it had come up from the Caribbean side of the Isthmus of Panama, had been loaded, and then it sinks. And now today, if you're interested, they've of course found the gold and raised it. Now you can buy a coin off of the USS America if you have lots of money. But in 1858, this devastates, everyone was kind of like, okay, we've got gold coming in, and then they lose this massive shipment of gold. So really, our economy was a real mess. Just trying to set you up for lots of problems in the American Civil War. And this is the famous, the big famous painting. I think it's either at Topeka or at Lawrence at KU. I don't remember the details. But it is just to show you that the country now falls into a civil war for nearly 5 years, or at 5 years. And we're not going to talk about the Civil War because that's a whole other thing, and Ken Burns has also done a really good job on that topic. But a quick map, if you're not really good with maps or a little rusty on that, just kind of a reminder of what states existed, which ones were still territories. And you have this, Oklahoma is still the Indian Territory. It's where all the Indians east of the Mississippi had been sent over the decades. And there's still an attempt to put some of the Kiowa and whatnot, to move them into Indian Territory. I also like to remind people that Russia still, at least for a couple more years, we purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. Not for the gold, it's not been found yet, but Secretary of State Seward will make that purchase. So you do have that old historic ties to Russia up in Alaska. So the gold is over here, and after the Civil War, and actually during the Civil War, the attempt now is going to be made to try to bring all of this into the United States. It was deadlocked. Ever since gold had been discovered, the politicians in Washington knew we needed to make connections, build the Transcontinental Railroad, but it was tied up between the North and the South. And so as soon as war was declared, what we often forget is Abraham Lincoln and the Senate and the House are now able to move on bringing kind of tying the West Coast to the rest of the country. They're able to do that because all the Southern politicians leave. And so this leaves all Northern senators and members of the House, other than perhaps Senator Johnson from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson. They all leave, and so bills can get passed at will, and they are. So the Great Plains, we'll come back and look at the Great Plains again. This is kind of a simple geography map. This is what the Great Plains are from a geographic standpoint when you look at terrain and climate. This is about the 100th parallel, and put some buffalo up there for you and whatnot. So people are they're gonna move out there, and these are the two bills that really encourage settlement. Because what the politicians need is they need people to move out, to carve up those territories, eventually turn them into states. The railroads, which I'll get to in just a second. Railroads today don't like spending money, right? But if railroads are going to build lines from, let's say, Kansas or Nebraska, in theory from Chicago to San Francisco, if they're going to build a railroad, they've got to have customers. And so that will happen. But to encourage settlement, we have a couple of bills, the Homestead Act of '62 and the Morrill Land Grant. These are incentives. I don't remember the details, but you'd get X amount of free acres if you would move, and you would move and live on it for 5 years. I forget, it was 150, maybe 300 if it was kind of crappy or pasture type land. But you got tremendous amount of acreage. You had to live on it for 5 years. You had to improve it, which I don't know what that would mean, building a building or whatever. There's all kinds of interesting stories about people taking advantage of the Homestead Act. You had to pay taxes, but the land itself was free. People would build temporary houses so that they could claim a section of land, and then maybe if the government agent left, they could move their house and they'd go claim another section. So, a good entrepreneurial spirit. But the Great Plains don't have a lot of trees. And so these are the kind of structures, the old sod houses that we're all familiar with and we've seen many pictures of. And so just a reminder of you know, I just can't, it's just hard for me to imagine that a family, typically the father, would decide we're going to leave Ohio and we're going to go out and move out west. And that's what you had to look forward to. The stories, primarily the diary accounts of many of the wives, many of the women that had to go out with their family, they just absolutely, they're horrible. They hate life. There's nothing to do. They're depressed. There's no other women to talk to. They can't talk to their husband. Those stories are out there, and they're really, you know, you try to make the best of them. So there's some good stories. You know, there's always some books that have the famous stories, but most of them, it's not very happy. It's not a very happy life. But there you go. And then these are the big ones. These were tied together, or these were kind of tied with those homesteading bills. And the railroads, of course, very, very powerful. Railroads were the rage at this time in history. This is why we got Alaska. William Henry Seward thought we would build a railroad over to Siberia. It's kind of a bizarre thing, but that was the reason for getting Alaska. He was convinced that Russia and Siberia were going to be the big industrial powerhouse in the future, and that we needed to connect ourselves. Of course, it can't, you know, really still can't be done without some serious tunneling, but that's what he visioned. So for the railroads, to move west, they got really good deals. The one thing the government had was land. And so the railroads, I forget the details, but for about every mile of track, they would get many, many miles of land, hundreds and thousands of acres on each side for every mile that they built. And then the railroads could turn around and sell that land to whoever, and that would be the money. That's kind of how the government was going to pay them. These incentives are still out there. We see that whether it's oil drilling or whether it's building wind farms, it's very similar today. It's just different things. But this is a nice map for you to see. So you see the swath of land. And the railroads, they're not dummies. The railroads are going to pick the routes that have the best areas. In some cases, they could have gone much straighter, but they follow where they know people will buy. And they need the water as well. But some of the routes up north get quite interesting. The Northern Pacific just kind of snakes along, and then they complained. They got out to the mountains, and the railroads complained that it was very difficult, and they really needed more land. And so the government will give them even more land. It's quite interesting and amazing, but it does work. And so the old locomotives, of course. Let's see. We'll just just hold on to that. In the meantime, the Civil War will end. And I'm not spending any time on the Civil War. This is a painting by a guy named Lovell of just the signing in McLean's farmhouse at Appomattox. So there you go. There's lots of photographs, but I just thought I'd show you this painting. Okay? So back to the railroads. This is the Transcontinental Railroad. Whoops. Somewhere. Transcontinental Railroad will be built. In theory, it was going to connect Chicago, but they already have rails over to the Missouri River. So the Transcontinental Railroad will connect San Francisco to Chicago. And if you don't remember, you had the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. And they met just above the Great Salt Lake at Promontory Point. Interesting, if you ever want to read about railroads, the South wanted a route. And that's why we bought the lower part of Arizona once upon a time. But the South was hoping to have a route. They were planning that. And then there was a big argument. Should it be in the North or the South? Civil War comes along, and we know what happens. It's going to be up here. Really important was a character by the name of Senator Stephen Douglas. He was from Illinois, and he had a lot of power and influence. And so he was able to really twist arms. There was also a young lawyer by the name of Abraham Lincoln, who spent some money, and he speculated on some land just in case a railroad happened to be built through Nebraska. So there are politicians who, they always seem to know. It's like, darn it, they always seem to do that inside trading stuff. And they were doing it on railroads. So they were speculating too. I don't know. It's probably in a Lincoln book somewhere, but you kind of have to look for it. Not sure how honest he was on that one, but it makes for interesting things. But it gets built. Those are the types of locomotives that were used, and they all burned wood, and so they needed a tremendous amount of wood, and the wood, of course, heated, and it was steam powered, and so they had to constantly stop. These locomotives had to stop constantly for either water or wood. Never gets much time, but can you imagine the thousands and thousands and thousands of cords of wood that had to be cut for these locomotives? And the water was actually easier to get than wood. So it was very big, very interesting, which meant that they had to stop all the time. So they built lots of towns all along these railroad lines. And then as the railroads got better, as they went to coal, they didn't have to stop as often. And so a lot of towns die because they're not needed anymore. So if your town wasn't very popular, the railroads often just, they picked winners and losers. And little side stories. We have a lot of, lots of Asians worked for the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific brought in a lot of Asians to work, Chinese, the coolies as they were often nicknamed. But then the Union Pacific had a lot of war veterans, a lot of Civil War veterans, both North and South veterans came out. And they were very good to work with because they were very used to that regimented, the regimented work, if you will. And there was the Golden Spike. A great story, if you don't remember they actually wired it up. I don't know how they did on technology, but they actually wired up the Golden Spike, so when they hit that with a hammer, it completed a telegraph signal to Washington. So the people on the East Coast, it took like 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, but nonetheless, they knew that the spike had been, that it had been completed. So it's kind of one of those cool little technology things associated with it. Anyway, there's the old photograph, and they've made movies. The old movie Union Pacific, they actually had a bunch of actors come in and they restaged that in one of the old Western movies. Back to the plains, but again, here you are, and I suspect in some of these photographs, these people probably dressed up. It was a big deal, especially back then. If someone's coming out in the middle of nowhere to take your photograph, and I'll show you one later on, which the whole family's lined up and they have their animals, I think. I think I have that photograph with us. You also have African Americans that are moving out onto the Great Plains, both before the Civil War is over and then after the Civil War was over. And the most famous, they came to be nicknamed the Exodusters, associated with the Exodus, second book of the Old Testament, of course, the mass movement of people, and then the dust because of just the dust out west. And so they get this nickname. Pap Singleton was, Benjamin Singleton, Pap Singleton was kind of their leader. He was their Moses for many of the Exodusters. He led a number of trips taking people from the South out to kind of central western Kansas. If you've ever heard of Nicodemus, Kansas, I don't know if you've been there, but I was out there about 5 years ago with my daughter, and they still have, or they used to have before COVID, they have annual reunions of the relatives of the original Exodusters. It's quite interesting. It's a little National Historic Monument. It's just a little nothing Kansas town now, but it was a big deal. Report of the minority in report and testimony. This startled a lot of people, especially a lot of Southern politicians, and they wondered, what on earth are you doing? You're taking our workers. Civil War is over, and so there actually will be congressional hearings. Pap Singleton is required to go to Washington, D.C. to testify to make sure that he's not up to no good. And it's in the congressional record. You can actually read all that stuff's there if you ever want to read it. But so he actually there's a big inquiry about why this is happening. And again, African American settlers as well, up in Nebraska. They weren't just in Nicodemus. There's a few other famous areas. But again, there's not a lot of wood. Wood's very expensive, and glass is super expensive to get it shipped out there. if you ever get a chance, go to the Steamboat Arabia Museum in Kansas City. Oh, good. All right. So this is mind-blowing, the quantity of stuff. And that was, what, about 1854. So that's pre-Civil War. And to know that there were just dozens of those ships all the time going, I had no idea that much material, that many things were being shipped out. Anyway. There were problems. Oh, there's my family. It's kind of cut off. It's a bigger, but they're all lined up. They have food like these melons cut out. My assumption is that it's to show what they're growing, to demonstrate their bounty. They've got the cow up on the roof, and you can't see them all, but they've got their team of mules over here, and the kids. No one has shoes on, but she's probably in that white dress. Well, that's probably the rare dress maybe when they go to church on Sunday, if they can go, because town might be many miles away. But there they are, and it's interesting. If you ever get a chance to look closely at that photograph, no one's smiling, but you weren't supposed to. I suppose they have to kind of, the exposure is an issue. But there were problems, lots of problems. Technology is constantly changing. Access to technology is difficult. Farming is becoming very, very competitive, and so you had to constantly invest. You don't have the phones. Of course, electricity won't come along till 88, and we know that around here even 1950 before some people had electricity and whatnot. But the technology was tough. Education, that's going to be pretty rare. To address that, we see bills, but notice it's 1887. So as people are moving out in the 50s and 60s, it's not there. But we do start to see increasingly laws passed to try to mandatory compulsory education's been around now since the 1830s and 40s, and slowly the school year was growing and the number of years and whatnot. But getting those one-room schoolhouses built in every township was still very difficult, especially out in the Great Plains areas. But we do start to see laws being passed, the Hatch Act and others, that eventually will start promoting even colleges, land-grant colleges and stuff, even like Lincoln, for example. Shipping rates are a real problem for the farmers. They're at the mercy of the railroads, and it didn't matter whether you had to ship 10 miles or 1,000 miles. You are truly at the mercy of what the railroads wanted to charge, and the farmers are very sparsely populated. They're spread out. They're very independent, and so it was very difficult for them to start taking on the railroads. But by 1900, the Grange has come along, and farmers' unions, and they'll eventually even have their own presidential candidate in William Jennings Bryan, who was from Nebraska. But it was very difficult to take on the railroads, who became so powerful at this time in history. They're in constant debt. Of course, you basically have money when you sold your crops. The rest of the year, you're living on credit, like we often see in some of the TV shows and the old movies. At least you have a little bit of accuracy with what people could and couldn't afford when they're in the old general store. Inflation and deflation, the use of silver, the use of gold. So many economic stories with regards to with the farmers, but lots of problems. It's tough. It's a tough life. Not to mention the Native Americans, which they are going to be confronting. Bonanza farms came along as increasingly some of the wealthier people started to go with bigger and bigger farms. The problem with Bonanza farms was that the farmers began trying to just go with single crops, which becomes problematic if you lose that crop. So the big farms, as the big farms put pressure on the little farms, the big farms would then often would run into bad winters, bad whatever, and the price of crops just fluctuated like crazy because these large farms, not Bonanza like the TV show, although I think that's kind of where they get the word, but just these super massive big, well, today we'd call it corporate farms, corporate hog farms or whatever. The same was true. They were experimenting back there with the crops, and it was a real problem for the little guy. And then Mother Nature, of course. Just constant changes and fluctuations in weather. You'd have a good year and a bad year, or 2 or 3 good years, 2 or 3 bad years, constantly problem. So we're going to leave the farmers, say goodbye to them. We might see the cowboys here in a little while. I put this up here just for those of you from Kansas City. I grew up in Kansas City and kind of like railroads. This was the first bridge built across the Missouri River in 1869, and St. Joe decided they weren't interested. Leavenworth decided they weren't interested, and so the railroad bridge was built in Kansas City, and this is what sets Kansas City off. Prior to that, Kansas City didn't amount to much, but when the Hannibal Bridge was completed, now Kansas City can take off. If you're a Kansas City person, we're on the south side. Right over in here would have been a little tiny place called Harlem. North Kansas City would be over here, and the old airport is to your left. There's nothing left of this except for one of these piers, which has most recently been buried by piles of debris. They're starting to fill in with, but it used to set there by itself. I don't think anybody knew what it was, but I did. So it's still there. I don't think they tore it down. It's just kind of buried now with all this other stuff. And that bridge is gone. But yeah, so Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad Bridge. And St. Joseph probably is really, probably a bad idea. Okay, so the Native Americans, and we'll spend a few minutes looking at them. Just tell me when it's break time. Are we here for 2 hours? Okay, all right. First of all, I put this picture in here to remind me to tell you that there's some great photographers who at the late 1800s were much like Catlin. I mentioned last fall, Catlin had gone out and painted paintings of the Indians, and he, fortunately for us, most all of his work was never lost, even though he took it to Europe once or twice. When we get into photography, of course, we have the Matthew Brady Studios, the famous photographs. Man, if you were in the East Coast or the Civil War or you were famous, the Brady photographers took your picture, and it's beautiful. But others did venture out. Curtis was one of them, and Edward Curtis has, you can look him up. This was a Curtis photograph, and he photographed lots of Native Americans out west in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Some are staged, of course, but what the heck, you know? We have the photographs that were really taken of real people. And this is just one of them. It's not maybe even the most exciting, but it is of a Native American couple, Indian couple in Alaska. And I put that up there to just point out, I'm not going to talk about the natives in Alaska and the Northwest. I just ran out of time and ran out of knowledge. But I put it up there for you. And his photographs are really quite beautiful if you get a chance or want to look at them. So I put one more slide about the Northwest, not Alaska, but up what would be around Seattle. And of course, that of course is some drawing, kind of a simple drawing and whatnot. And then the totem poles. And then one of the old photographs, I don't think this is a Curtis photograph, but it's another one of these right in the late 1800s. And it just reminds us how different people are because of the regions they live, the climate that they have to live in and whatnot. This is actually supposed to be a group of people going to a party, going to what were called potlatches. And as I get older, I'm kind of liking the idea of a potlatch. It's when it was kind of one of these coming of age kind of a ceremony in which a young man or a man of some age would invite all the other men to his, sorry ladies, he would invite all the other men to his abode, to his home, and you were expected to take something of his with you. And he's demonstrating his lack of need for possessions. And so perhaps I should have one and you'll have to take. But the problem was then the next guy would have one and then I had to go to his and so you're kind of changing goods. But potlatch is interesting things to read about. Also the name of a gigantic corporation that actually used to own Weyerhaeuser up in the Northwest. But potlatches. So back to the Great Plains. We'll spend a little bit of time here. The guy on the left, that's Curly Bear Wagner. I met him when I was younger. He was a nice guy. Anyway, he died, 15 years ago of cancer. But he was a Blackfoot Indian, and he would give speeches and visit with people at Glacier National Park. And really quite fascinating. Back when I didn't know who Native Americans I did. I thought they were all dead. And so he was kind of my introduction and a reminder. So. But see again, you see a lot of you. Most of you, I'm sure, have traveled a little bit, and it's just a treeless desert, if you will. Of course, there's trees out there, but they're not very big, so you can't really cut timber and have lumber. And this is just a reminder, there's so many different tribes, and as soon as we zoom in on one, then we could spread that out, and there's multiple. As soon as we find the Sioux Indian, wherever they are, well, then all of a sudden we go, well, gosh, there's 6 or 7 different types of Sioux Indians, or we see the Kiowa, well, again, the Comanche, well, sometimes they were there, and then sometimes they had moved here. You have the bigger ones, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Crow, and whatnot, and many of them don't like each other. This is, again, something that, I have a slide here in a minute. This is something that Washington, D.C. doesn't understand. They assume that Indians are Indians and that if you have a treaty with Indians, but some of these Indians have not liked each other forever. If I shouldn't say that, but they haven't liked each other for years and years and years. And these ongoing grudges. I might have mentioned when I talked about the attempt, Kit Carson was involved in the attempt to bring the Navajo onto the reservation, and they literally had them on the reservation, and they bring in the Apache, and they've got them right now. Well, they hated each other, and they were constantly fighting and stealing and beating each other up every day, and again, the government officials don't understand that. Perhaps they would have at least tried to separate them somehow, but they didn't. And so it's really problematic. And I think this is great, especially if you watched the show last night. This was brought to my attention. Another student back in college once brought in a buffalo nickel and passed it all around, and his whole presentation. So he was ahead of his time, ahead of Ken Burns by 40 years. But he was pointing out that, you can't have one without the other. And I think that's what Ken Burns is trying to explain quite clearly, and that is without the buffalo, the Indians die. Their civilization, their way of life, it just came to a complete, just died on the Great Plains. And so I put that up there just to remind us of that. And one of the drawings, it was actually, part of this was actually early on in the Ken Burns show last night. I noticed he was using these similar drawings, old paintings. I don't know who did the work, but I noticed he drew on it as well. And they're holding various clubs and whatnot. This guy right here, this is not a spear, it's a coup stick. And there is a coup stick, a couple of them. And notice this is on someone's, this is on someone's floor, obviously, nice finished wood floor. I'm not sure about this one. And I have to be honest, I took one of these photographs off of eBay. So I want you to know they're out there. But the real coup sticks were very, very important because many of the Plains Indians used those coups. They counted coup. And when they would get into battles, I won't pick on you, but I'll come over to this man. But if they would fight and defeat their enemy in battle, then it was important for them to touch him to get his spirit, to draw that spirit from him, to weaken him. Now this is prior to rifles and whatnot, the counting of coup, and no doubt it was both for people who are killed and for people who are just had the tar beaten out of them. But the counting of coup was very, very, very important. And so it was really important, almost like, we hear about people notching them, the old gunfighters notching their handle on how many people they've shot. Counting coup is very important. Of course, then you go back in the evening and you're bragging about this. And truly, this does happen. You brag about it, you're counting coup, and you're retelling the stories. And this was very important. This is very important. And of course, if I was young and had some success, I'm going to be recognized. It's going to be noted by the elders that I've had that I'm emerging or whatever. It doesn't take long before the the powers that be in the Anglo-American world realized that, much like Ken Burns is trying to explain to us, if you eliminate the buffalo, you eliminate the food source, the livelihood of the Indians. There's other factors as well. The railroads can't run if there's 10,000 buffalo on the tracks. And we're actually, I'm reminded of that when I watch Polar Express. When the railroad has to stop, and the moose or the reindeer are out there, and the train is stopped. That's exactly what happens, and those trains can't go, and that's, time is business, and so people are hired to shoot buffalo. We have to feed the workers. There's all the stories, and I think Ken Burns probably hits on them. There's also money to be made from the pelts. There'll be money to be made from the tongues. And so you'll have these mass slaughters for just parts of the animals. And then later on, spoiler alert if you didn't see the first part, but we're also reminded of the need, the later need for the bones, which came along as it dawned on people, which is kind of interesting. But Easterners pointed out that those could be crushed and used for fertilizer. What I didn't think about was, was it also processing milk? There was something last night that I was like, huh? But they were crushing. I forget what it was besides the fertilizer. This is not uncommon though, because after the Napoleonic Wars, those battlefields were being cleaned up, and the bones of the soldiers were being used for fertilizer in Europe as well. So again, you don't always see that it's not in the textbooks, but again, how many buffalo, if those are just buffalo skulls, how many buffalo is he standing on? Pelts. Let's see if, how many pelts are those? So, and there was a lot of money to be made. And you could go out on hunting tours, and you just simply, the trains would take you out, and if you paid enough, they would just stop, and you could just shoot buffalo out the windows of the passenger cars and whatnot. So back in Washington, D.C., the first Indian Appropriations Act is in 1951. It's your standard government law. It has to be renewed. It has to be financed. And when you start talking about politicians and financing things, then you can see how this starts to become, problematic. And it will be. As administrations change, as people are elected and unelected, you'll get new officials who have new agendas, who have new ideas, who have friends that they have to kind of pay off, and that's all, just like we have today. It was happening back then. Unfortunately, though, of course, it's the Native American that is going to be bouncing around and having to deal with all these changes that someone 2,000 miles away thinks they know better on. And so I pulled a quote out of a really good book that kind of really looks at the political and the policy aspects of the Native American, in which you just have, there's so much going on. The last thing I put on this slide is the Dawes Act. Jumping ahead, it's so difficult to try to know how to cover history. But by 1887, this is kind of the last really sad chapter for the various Indian policies that come along. And the Dawes Act will be, again, an argument that the Native Americans don't need big reservations. That if we just give every Indian the same amount of land, they'll be fine with that, and that will free up a lot more land for other people. So the Dawes Act takes gigantic reservations that have been created. I'll show you one in a little bit, and it just reduces it down to next to nothing. It's kind of almost the final stealing of Native Americans' land, or I shouldn't say stealing, but it certainly doesn't have them involved in the decision-making process. So my trusty assistant is Doris is handing out a reference list of various books. Many of them I've drawn information from. A few of them on there I haven't, but they're on my lists of to get to books. I'm sure we all have those. we could probably spend an hour just going through that, but I won't. But I'll give them to you, and you can always look through them and see if some of them might catch your attention, or you might want to look further. As you know, you can, of course, Google anything, or you can do a word search on anything. There might even be some of those. I know a few of them are actually completely online on, what is it, Gutenberg and whatnot, has a lot of free books that you can just read, and certainly the archives has a few. But she's handing those out, and you can do with them what you like. The lyrics were to the song, which really, if you were sitting right here, you maybe heard, but if you want to listen to it, that stuff's all free and online as well. So there's so many problems. I've made a short list of problems between, if you will, the reds and the whites, if we just simplify it to the colors that are often associated with various peoples. And I made a couple of columns. One is kind of white man problems, and the other is red man problems, if you will. And changes for the soldiers after the war. There were, when the war's over, there were gazillions, maybe 5 million Union soldiers, I think that's about right, that what do you do with them? Do they go back home? Most do, a lot don't. But I just simply want to boil it down to this, and that is, if you were an officer, as soon as that war comes to an end, the chances of promotion have dried up. And so there's a tremendous number of low-ranking officers with nowhere to go. They have to go out west in most cases if they want to stay in the military. It's very isolated. And I'm always reminded of the first few minutes of Dances with Wolves, in which whatever Costner's name was in the movie, he shows up at that fort, and the captain's kind of gone nuts, and eventually kills himself pretty quickly into that. But you get completely isolated. There's nowhere for promotion, and that's so psychologically that's going to be very problematic for a lot of the soldiers that decide to stay in the military. And also the military is pretty much going to take over dealing with the Indian Wars, and so which is completely different from Civil War battlefields, but it's going to be there, and we're going to see a lot of faces that we know. There's constant political changes. So these are just problems. These are problems with who are the Indians negotiating with? Who are they encountering? Pre-war soldiers, now we're going to have post-war trained soldiers and officers. And the political changes are constant, something that the Native Americans certainly don't understand. But you have presidents being elected every 4 years. I think countries today still don't understand the United States because, they have a dictator for 30 years and we've had 6 presidents. And how do they deal with them? And 6 different secretaries of state. The same is true with the Native Americans. You have constant political changes. Certainly we had different presidents. And something that's often not looked at is the Senate and the House. There was a lot of dysfunction between those two. Arguably, we could say there still is. But the Senate's making the treaties. The House isn't, right? The Senate's making the treaties. But who's funding all of these bills? And so the House would often get, they're using the power of the purse to try to kind of leverage their importance in the legislature and trying to kind of challenge the Senate. So as these various bills are passed, these various Indian acts, Indian this, Indian that, the House wants to be a part of this as well. And so they're going to maybe want certain people appointed. It's not a lot of Democrat and Republican right now because the Democrats died, if you will, temporarily. They died with the South. And so it's the Republicans that are running the United States government almost exclusively. You have radicals and you have moderates, but it's all Republicans, generally speaking, for some time after the Civil War. And you also have this, and it doesn't get enough attention except for one of those books, which I can't think off the top of my head, really does look at some of the reform issues, and it reminds us of what's going on, that there's growing numbers of reformers in the East that when they read about an atrocity, the Sand Creek Massacre or the Fetterman Massacre or one of these mass deaths, that the reformers really began speaking up and challenging what's happening in the West. But yet at the same time, it's the military that's trying to, so you don't have the reformers aren't out in the West doing the hands-on work, the military is, and the military will occasionally be getting instructions from reformists, Quakers, as Grant's going to turn to religious groups to try to implement Indian policy. This is very complicated, just so many layers. It's no wonder things didn't work very well. And then, of course, you have retribution. Inevitably, you'll have some soldier whose family has been killed by the Indians, and now he's responsible for working with the Indians. And that, so he's torn. And the same is true with the Native Americans. They will have family members that were murdered by the soldiers, and to them, all the soldiers are the same. This is real problems. This is complicated. And I think you understand that. Distance. We always overlook distance. It was a major problem in the Vietnam War, of course, major problem in the American Revolution, and certainly it's a problem here in that we've got Washington, D.C., and the people in New York City and Boston that, my gosh, they're sitting down at a nice dinner table talking about the Indians not being treated fairly. Well, that's fine, but have they ever been past St. Louis? Probably never. So distance is a real problem both ways. People travel there. It's quite interesting. Kit Carson, having gone back and forth a couple of times, literally, mostly on foot and a horse. And it's hard to think, but you don't have presidents that are going out. You have a couple, but you don't have them going out and other politicians going out to see firsthand. We do have a lot of Indians that make their way to Washington, D.C., and there are interesting photographs of them meeting and, of course, supposedly solidifying treaties of which they can only account for themselves and not other people. And again, the whites don't understand the tribe versus tribe historical friction in some cases. And I've mentioned this, that the tribal chiefs are not speaking for the others. You also have a history of broken promises, and so the assumption, and both sides, by the way, you could interchange a lot of this. And you also have, of course, a lot of the young Indians who constantly believe that the elders are being too passive, that they're not confronting. This is not uncommon even today. That youth and energy and idealistic, it's always, and it's always the college campuses where people are raising hell. Well, that's because they're not working and they got a lot of energy and time, and they're being presented with a lot of ideas. It was that way when I was in college. I'm sure, I know it's that way today as well. And then we all have to go get jobs and we're too damn tired to go out and raise hell and just want to sit down and relax. And it's not uncommon, it's not uncommon with the Native American. And again, the retribution issues and the cultural language. And then gold. Every time things kind of seem to be calming down, gold is discovered. And everything's out the window with gold, at least when it comes to the Native Americans. They're in the way. If there's gold, they're in the way, whether it's California or Colorado or Montana or the Black Hills. Let's see here. This is an interesting story if you ever want to read about the whole political aspects, and that is when Grant comes along. Of course, we've had the whole issues of Lincoln's death, and then no one liked Andrew Johnson, and he's impeached, but then Grant is elected in 68, takes the oath in 69. But early on, Grant's going to try to kind of take control of the issue of the Indian problem, if you will, the question of the Indians. And he will appoint right away, as his Commissioner of Indian Affairs, he'll be there for about 5 years, maybe 6, a man by the name of Eli Parker, who Grant knows very, very well. He has worked with Grant throughout the Civil War, certainly since Vicksburg. He has been at Grant's side as an advisor, secretary, aide-de-camp. At Appomattox, I don't know how quickly I can go backwards. We'll try it. That's Eli Parker right there. That's why I showed you that picture. I knew I was going to come back to it. That's George Custer. Has the red bow tie. If you ever look carefully, he's like, he was never in uniform. But if you're a crazy fighter, you get a pass. But that's George Armstrong Custer, and that's Eli Parker, who wrote out Grant. Grant dictated the terms of surrender. Eli Parker wrote them down, and Lee is signing the document that Eli Parker wrote. So, and Eli Parker was a full-blood Seneca Indian, and so it's also just a quick reminder that Grant could probably, and I'm going to guess that generally speaking, Grant probably was not worried about your background; it was your ability. And I'm making that up. I have not read that, but when a general has a full-blooded Indian doing really key things and is literally listening to him as his number one advisor, it tells me that Grant is beyond those things that we often get hung up on. All right, here we have to go back through this now, so bear with me.
Just a question about that. How much would Parker understand the Western Indians as opposed to his Seneca?
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's a good question. How I'm going to guess only personal experiences. He's chief of the Seneca, and at this time the Seneca are, I don't want it, nothing personal, they're kind of has-beens. They have been out of power for so long, but he's also really well respected in the world of the Iroquois. So he does certainly know. He's got, that's his history. That's his, he certainly has an experience. So he's certainly going to be better than not having an Indian in that position. He gets into it though. He has problems with people that'll be on the Indian board of commissioners. So he eventually does resign. But at least Grant was making an effort. And it's an interesting read, but it's still, they keep coming back to the fact that there's just too many moving parts between the two cultures. I put this in here next to remind you. So regardless of what Parker, and by the way, one of the arguments with Grant was that Grant was politics and stuff, and so the Senate and the House was kind of upset with what Grant was wanting to do with regards to Indians. It's all about, we're going to civilize them, we're going to assimilate them, we're going to really work on this reservation, we're going to do it peacefully. It's real interesting. He really tried to seriously, make this a peaceful, not transition, but a peaceful takeover of your lives. And he had a lot of political pushback, and so he said, fine. And he actually then turned to the religious groups, and he let the various Protestant groups bring in people. He said, fine, if we're not going to have politicians, we'll bring in the Quakers and others and let them manage it, which didn't work real well. But that's because events keep happening out west. Keep kind of precluding. Every time they think they've got something figured out, every time they think they've made a step forward, in our case, gold will be discovered. And it's like, doesn't matter. Here's the people that have to implement the various Indian policy. William Tecumseh Sherman. So, they're all military guys. And Grant, this is who Grant turns to. Even Eli Parker was, and this is, some people often argue, this is one of Grant's downfalls, is that he relied too much on his military connections. But Sherman was put in charge of the, if you will, the Indian Wars. Sherman stays, he goes out west a couple times anyway, but he pretty much stays in Washington. Phil Sheridan will be his kind of man on the, see, this is Custer again, by the way. God forbid he he might as well wear a cape. But that's Phil Sheridan. I don't know the others without cheating and looking down here to see who they were, but that is George Armstrong Custer. So these are the men that are kind of in the West implementing government policy. And Grant then will turn to Sherman for basically kind of that cabinet level meeting. Now, I just want to take a look at a couple of other things. This is a great example of a retribution, if you will. you can see this is a quote. This is John Shivington, Colonel John Shivington, who is sent to Colorado to deal with, to work with getting the Indians on the reservations. Now, this is probably not a great choice, but this is what we have. And he runs into a governor who's needing to kind of boost his political power, or not his power, but he's kind of the governor of Colorado, the territory, just trying to boost his name. And so he works with Shivington, and Shivington is sent off to the southeastern part of Colorado to send the Indians to the reservation. What has happened, you don't see here, is that his wife has been killed by Indians, and I believe one of his children. So again, though, today we'd probably screen that out and, not sending. The result is the Sand Creek Massacre. One of the most recent national parks that we've created is the Sand Creek Battlefield. Sand Creek Massacre, I think they call it Battlefield, but it's a new monument you can go to. There's not much there, but it's interesting to go to and see. But this was Black Kettle, and Black Kettle had recently kind of followed all the agreements and had agreed to move his people onto a reservation. And John Shivington, his men showed up. Shivington had no intentions of anything other than killing the Indians, over 200 of which will be killed, mostly women and children. Men are out hunting. So, right here at the end of the war, people are like, well, maybe, so the next group of Indians is not going to be interested in signing a treaty. There was an inquest. There's a big, Eli Parker, was it Parker? No, he was on the Fetterman. But there will be an inquest in Washington, D.C. Shivington had to testify. Nothing was done to him, but there was there's another, committee hearing about all of this. Shortly thereafter, gold is discovered in Montana. And to get to the gold fields in Montana, the most logical route for people was to go along the Oregon Trail, and when they got over to eastern Wyoming, they would branch off and they would head up what became known as the Bozeman Trail, and they would go to the gold fields. This is the Bozeman Trail. It's sometimes in the United States we have these trails open, right? Like the Appalachian Trail, the Ozark Trail. And so you can, I suppose, with probably the right signatures, you can just hike along the Bozeman Trail. What happens, though, is the Bozeman Trail is really close. The Bozeman Trail is going to be really close to the Black Hills, right over here. Okay? And the Black Hills are like the number one most sacred place for the Plains Indians that exists. Okay? So as long as people don't stray, but miners like to look around and they're always wondering if maybe there's gold in them our hills. And they're going to make their way into the Black Hills. As the Bozeman Trail became more and more popular, then they built a series of forts along there for people to have a place of safety to go to. And one of the forts that was right up near the Montana border. I forget the name of the fort. Doesn't really matter today, but it was one of those typical stockade forts, almost like you'd see in the old movies. I mean, it's just, that's truly kind of what it looked like. And the Captain Fetterman was not in charge of the fort, but his superior sent him out one morning to basically set and watch guys cut timber. There were men that were sent out, loggers that were sent out to cut timber and firewood. And he was sent out with a small detachment of soldiers, and their job was to basically stand guard while these guys worked. Okay? Fine and dandy. Fetterman goes out the gate, and you can visualize it. We can go ahead and just a simpleton visit. You know, they're going to close the wooden gates, and their guys are going out there, and the lumberjacks, and we'll go ahead and put plaid on the lumberjacks, right? And they're walking out, and the guy in charge, the CO, the commanding officer, tells Fetterman, if you see Indians, don't chase them, just round up the guy and come back. Oh yeah, okay. And off he goes. They're out working, and lo and behold, they see a few Indians. In fact, one of these young Indians starts showing off, teasing the soldiers. I don't know if he mooned him or what, but you can visualize this. And the men are like checking, you know, they're like aiming and stuff. And finally Fetterman's like, go for it. And they chase, of course, this is a young crazy horse that's doing this. And they chase, and it's just your standard. They chase Fetterman, and men take off, and they chase him over the hill. Well, gosh, there's a hell of a lot of Indians on the other side of the hill. They then proceed to kill Fetterman and all these other guys. Okay, so we have the Fetterman Massacre, December 1866. And so back in Washington, D.C., gold is being discovered. More and more people are going up to Montana. We're building forts. Now the forts are not even safe. You know, never mind the little details. Never mind the fact that Fetterman was this. And so we have to do something. Okay? Got to act. You can hear the politicians all wanting to speech and get on the congressional record. So they have a big meeting at Fort Laramie, which I showed you a picture of months ago that you may not remember. But down at Fort Laramie, which is down here, they're going to have a big meeting. And this time they send out delegations to bring in all the Indians. We're going to bring them all in. And so there's thousands of Indians and white people, and of course, no doubt people selling trinkets and everything else. But they meet at Fort Laramie, and they're going to have a big treaty. And by gosh, this is the one that's going to get all of the Native Americans on the Great Plains onto reservations. And everybody's going to be safe. Except for all the Indians that did not attend, who of course said, you're not signing for me, which included all these big name heavy hitters that we've all heard of. So at the Fort Laramie Treaty, like 2/3 of South Dakota is given to the Indians. Wow, it's pretty big. Okay. And so they sign it, and then you can look carefully at this reservation boundary from the Missouri River over to whatever line of longitude that was. And then you can see, lost in 1877, lost in 1889, lost in 1910, current tribal lands. And so it really gets carved up. All right? It included the Black Hills. Oh, that's fine. That's what the Indians would, of course, expect and need and want. So, for a brief moment, this works, except for all the Indians who, of course, no, they didn't sign it. They weren't there. Photograph of the Black Hills. I had to find one, you know, no Mount Rushmore in this picture, no cars or anything, but this is quite beautiful. Man, it was super sacred to the Native Americans on what we often call the Northern Great Plains. Very, very important. And then darned if in 1874 somebody thinks they found gold. One of those guys drifted off, wasn't supposed to be there, thinks maybe they found gold. Got to try to keep it quiet. Got to try to keep it under wraps. So to make sure that there is or isn't gold, we're going to send out some scientists. And so there's a small number of scientists and a hell of a lot of soldiers that go out. And the guy in charge is supposed to be, I couldn't make him out. I've read where it's this guy, but I really think it's supposed to be this guy. It's still the same person. That was George Armstrong Custer. So Custer was sent out. Well, if you know anything about Custer, you know that he's already been dreaming about being president of the United States. And so he and his wife Elizabeth, they're always talking about being president. Well, if you want to be president and you're out west, you've really got to make a name for yourself. And he is all about, this is a guy that wore the red sash. He's never in uniform. But because he's just kind of crazy and successful enough, everyone turns. And so he's in charge. Well, it's in his interest to find gold, because then he can be the person that said, we found gold. Anyway, so the scientists, lo and behold, they do find gold. It's not very much, but not very much looks bad in the papers. So you take out the not very much and you just put gold discovered. Now what happens, of course, is that then people come out of the woodworks, if you will, and now everyone, all these people who don't care or don't understand the Indians are going to go to the Black Hills because they want to pan for gold. Custer is in trouble now, and so he's put in the doghouse. He's like, he gets sent to North Dakota, which of course is quite depressing for him because that's like a death sentence. He's not gonna be president if you're sent. Anyway, but it's an interesting read. There's some great photographs about. Now we just have photographs all the time. Sometimes they're not real clear, but you can just see this is, imagine the native. Now, if you're an Indian and you see this, you have to remember that in that treaty, that Fort Laramie Treaty, the Army had the right to go look for places to build forts. And so in theory, but then you might still go, God, that's a hell of a lot of people to look for a place to build a fort. But anyway, that was the justification. Custer can kind of go out there and say, well, we're not breaking the treaty. And I just happen to have some engineers with me, geologists being engineers. So there's Custer. There's so many books. Everybody loves Custer. He's just kind of this larger-than-life figure. Quite an interesting person. He was one of my dad's. It's a famous picture of him with his Indian scouts. I used to know their names, but some of the famous Indian scouts and his dogs. He had these dogs that just went everywhere with him. This is a couple of pictures of his wife. I'm not sure why she's in a military uniform. Not sure, what they did on their own time. I don't know, but that's Elizabeth, and they truly did. It was all about him being president someday, and you can see it's not going to happen. He'll be killed. So he was sent up to just south of Bismarck, North Dakota, at a place called Fort Abraham Lincoln. You can go there today. They have the house. It's the original house has been probably rebuilt, remodeled, but it looks exactly like it did when he left. And the people that work there wear period clothing, so you kind of get that. And they have a couple of other buildings. But that's where the 7th Cavalry was when, after the gold discovery and after all the, then the government in Washington said, we have all those people that didn't sign the treaty, it's time to bring them in as well because this is not going to go well. And so now the search is out to find Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, and another one by the name of another chief named Gall. These are like the big four, if you will. And so the army is sent out, not under Custer's leadership, but is sent out. And Custer will be called on because of his expertise. And so there's now this attempt to round up the Indians that didn't sign the treaty. Custer gets word of this in 76 and is excited. He can visualize himself being, taking the oath of office, I'm sure, and Libby's probably excited. And off he goes from North Dakota straight over to Montana to meet these other military men and their various I don't want to get into the regiments and brigades, but he goes off with the 7th Cavalry to meet up with the other soldiers. What he doesn't do, of course, is he doesn't follow orders when he gets there because he's so excited. And hell, if I'm the first one, this will really get me back up on, the front page. Well, he did make it on the front page and then also on the back page under obituaries. But he does. And so some of you know the stories. One of the probably simplest, best books is Son of the Morning Star. It just kind of gets to the point. It's a great book and kind of takes a look at the battle and some basic things. But Son of the Morning Star looks at both sides. A lot of Indian input on the battle at the Little Bighorn as well as the Army's version. But anyway, so here's the house. You can go and see it. It's cool. It's worth going. I mean, if you're going to North Dakota, it's definitely something to stop and see. And then there's some of the 7th Cavalry. I don't know who they are in particular. In fact, I think it's well after they all weren't killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So this is probably well after, based on that hat that he's got on. There used to be debates about whether or not there was any photographs of Crazy Horse, and this is pretty much accepted to be Crazy Horse. And there's a link to stories. There's lots and lots of great books on Red Cloud and Sitting Bull, of course. Sitting Bull goes on, as you know. I've got him later on. He's out with Buffalo Bill, touring the country. So some of the ending stories are quite interesting. Quanah Parker, if you did anyone watch last night the Buffalo and they mentioned Quanah Parker? There was a recent book that came out about him, which is good, but he lived down in Oklahoma somewhere, and his house was for sale a few years ago. So it's hard to kind of wrap yourself around it. Wait a second, this famous Indian who killed lots of Americans in these various Indian battles. Wait a second, his house is for sale? It's strange sometimes. Anyway, there they are. I don't know why that's coming up. I don't think pushing the wrong buttons. Well, I'm not going to fight the battle. I'm not going to bring Colonel Terry and Reno and all that. We're not going to get into all that. But the bottom line is Custer, who did not wait, if you will, to use a modern day phrase as my students would talk, Custer didn't wait for backup. And in fact, he was in such a hurry, he kind of leaves his sabers and other things behind so he can move more quickly. And his scouts told him, the scout said, "We have found more Indians than we've ever seen in one spot in our entire lives." And he's like, "Oh, that can't be." And off he went. So he really he really made some dumb mistakes. And this is a famous painting done for Anheuser-Busch at the turn of the century. Yes?
That painting is a child, I'm 80 years old. I swear it was in every barber shop on neighborhood tavern.
Yes. And I failed to bring my show and tell. I've got one of these. And yeah, it's a good one. There's lots of different versions of them, and they were in every bar, every barber shop, and advertised lots of things. And I think they went back. I don't know which one this is, but there's a couple of rear ends of Indians that were showing, and some people raised hell at the turn of the century and said, "Oh, this is obscene," and so they covered up the Indians' bottoms. It's horribly inaccurate, but it didn't matter. It was just advertising, or kind of a romantic advertising. Everyone remembered Custer's last. I guess he needed a beer. I mean, after the fight. But it's art. It's not probably good art, but it's always interesting to look at and to tear apart if you want to. There's an excellent book on that list. I should send out a note or something. There's a book that was written about the Custer battle by a guy who grew up and lived next to the battlefield his whole life. It's like 60 years in Custer's shadow. You'll have to look on the list later. And it's excruciatingly painful to read because he's not a writer. He's just a guy that grew up and lived there. And he watched people come in that would write books. He said people would come in and stay for a week or two and walk around and leave. They would take a few pictures and leave. He said, "I lived here." And he completely challenges everything that the books say, because the books all want you to be convinced that Custer was truly the last one killed. And this guy says, "Oh, hell no, Custer was probably killed early because his troops didn't do anything that made any sense. And this was at a time in which you were under kind of blind obedience." And they said, if Custer's killed early, these men would not have, Custer was so sharp at what he would do that if he was dead, they would not have probably, done what they ended up doing. It's just an interesting take by a non-writer, a non-skilled scholar writer who said, "Look, I've lived here, I've walked this, I know the creek, I know when it floods, I know where you can go and can't go." It's quite interesting. I encourage you to read it. You do have to just say, okay, grammar's going to be an issue here, but we're going to do it. Anyway, but it's quite interesting. And of course, what happens is President Grant and the rest of the world find out a couple of weeks later that the 7th Cavalry has been annihilated. And it's a major embarrassment for, if you will, the government, and certainly for the Army, and certainly for the 7th Cavalry. as well over 200 soldiers are killed. Now, this is kind of a semi-finished. There's going to be a couple slides that don't look really good, but if you're the Indians and you've just had this major success and big victory over Custer, they knew who Custer was, but they decided they better get the heck out of there. And so the Indians moved. Sitting Bull took many of them north, and they moved into Canada. They left the country, and for a brief period, he will stay in Canada. I mention this because it's an interesting story when he's up there. Things go horribly wrong. His people, there's not any food for them. The buffalo, there's not the buffalo they were hoping for in Canada. The Great Mother, Canada was known to a lot of to the Northern Indians as the Great Mother. It just had been there. It was just kind of this interesting historical kind of origin stories and whatnot. But Sitting Bull goes into Canada, and he ends up staying in an area real close to a place called Fort Walsh, which you can go to as well. It's been rebuilt. It's in an area of southwestern Saskatchewan that looks very similar to the Black Hills. It's just a little rugged area in an area around the plains of Canada. And it is at Fort Walsh where it's now called Fort Walsh, where he will meet up with, I think I have got his picture. There's Fort Walsh today. It's neat. It's worth going and seeing. They also wear period clothing. It's always funner to see people, you kind of really get into it. You park over here, but you go in there. But this is where, and it is that guy, okay, who is going to convince Custer, or he's going to convince Sitting Bull to return to the United States. He's going to help negotiate the return of Sitting Bull. This guy his last name is Walsh, and he is also the guy who kind of unifies and creates the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. There was kind of an Eastern and a Western version of their Mounties, and he brings it together. And so he's got his own little fame and fortune going. But it's another one of those interesting side stories. And because it's Canadian, we don't hear about it much in our books, right? So, again, okay. So Sitting Bull finds himself back in the United States. He becomes this folk hero. It won't be long before Sitting Bull is in Chicago, and he meets a gal named Annie Oakley. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but he goes on to, Sitting Bull's life just kind of keeps going. It's quite strange. But for the Indians, that was their last gasp, really, on the plains. They all agree to move back to Indian reservations. Life has been miserable for many, many, many of them. And I jump to this to kind of bring a sad closure, if you will, to the Plains Indians. But we have to go out and meet Jack Wilson, which is not obviously a very Indian-sounding name. That's his Christian name, Jack Wilson. Wavoka was his name, a Paiute Indian, lived out in Nevada, along the Nevada-California border. And shortly after Sitting Bull is back in the United States, Wavoka has a vision. And Wavoka's vision, in his vision, is revealed that the Indians are going to return to greatness, that they are going to turn back the clock, if you will, and that they will once again, not rule the world, but they will once again be free on the plains. The buffalo will return. And at a time in which people are in such a state of despair, it seems to be something that may in fact happen. And in his vision, he explains that if the Indians will simply wear their a ghost shirt, if they simply will wear a vest that has been made with that in mind, that they will be impenetrable to the white man's bullets. Okay? Well, we know where this is going. Oops, sorry, wrong button. My clicker's on the side, that's why. Wavoka, so word spreads, right? Word spreads. Oh, Wavoka's, he's Paiute Indian. Word spreads like wildfire, if you will. And the other Indian tribes in the plains are hearing about this, and they're like, we want to meet with him. And so here you see this, if you will, this heavy hitters meeting with him. Don't think the whites don't hear about this as well, and they're starting to get, wait a second, these meetings, and this is not what we want. The reservation, this could be, so both sides are seeing this as a possible issue. Sitting Bull discounts it. He says, this is not going to happen. It's not, he said, you're dreaming, this is not going to work. But a lot of the young people they've never experienced. In the meantime, the government decides we've got to crush this before it happens. We've got to bring this to an end. And so, let's see, pushing the wrong buttons. Hoping I'm not. There's a Ghost Dance shirt. Again, I don't want to tell you, you probably can buy them, but these were very, very important. And so you can see how people are desperate and they're looking for something. And the drawing of the Ghost Dance, and it was explained how no doubt it evolves and takes on different characters, different meanings. That's a long, I don't know if you can read it. The Headquarters Department of Dakota, St. Paul, Minnesota, 1890, commanding officer at Fort Yates. The division commander has directed that you make it your special duty to secure the person of Sitting Bull. Call on Indian agent to cooperate and render. They decided we better bring in Sitting Bull. He's been living out on the edge of the reservation out here in a house. Let's bring him right in by the officers' quarters so that because he is still very powerful. He has become this sensation, right? He's a folk hero. He's even a hero in the world of many of the white people. And don't think the media hasn't, and people writing books haven't. They are so much into this stuff too. It turns out that there's a lot of people, including the military officers, that don't like Sitting Bull. And so this becomes an opportunity that Sitting Bull might not make it. And there's always question about how this happens. Okay, but there's Sitting Bull. These are the various lands that used to be and are and whatnot. He's down in this area. And Sitting Bull is going to be killed. And he apparently tried to flee when they went to arrest him. And again, you get multiple sides that, will tell you this is what really happened. The bottom line, though, Sitting Bull, who's already become a hero, he's been in New York. I think he went to Europe. I don't remember. But this is a guy who now is back on the reservation and is killed so that he doesn't give a positive nod to the Ghost Dance and to all of this. And it's kind of sad, but there's a little marker for him. When I was there, his trash was everywhere. It's up in South Dakota. This is the final straw. So a couple of weeks later, then when Sitting Bull's killed, a lot of other Indians said, that's it, and they start leaving the reservations. They just start walking off. And the government says, we can't let that happen. And so one of the leaders, whose name was Bigfoot, there he is, frozen to death, dead, frozen, in these really gross, disgusting, because it was the 28th of December in South Dakota. But at Wounded Knee, an army contingent was sent out to round up the Miniconjou, which was another group of, I think, Sioux, if I'm not mistaken. But Bigfoot and his Miniconjou were to be rounded up and not allowed to leave the reservation. The 7th Cavalry was sent out to get the Miniconjou, and they had no intentions of bringing anybody back alive. And so this is a wholesale slaughter with cannon and whatnot. And then they're all just left to lay there and froze to death. And the photographers came along, and as the snow melted, of course, then you have these really sad, the Wounded Knee is often seen as the end of the Great Plains. It's kind of that final event of the Indians on the Great Plains. I can keep going probably for 2 more hours. I know it's about time to quit. I get that. But Helen Hunt Jackson, this book is on the list. She was perhaps the most vocal. I mean, she had the most clout in the East. She's a writer already, and she took it upon, if you will, herself and her abilities to write about the mistreatment of the Indians throughout the history of the United States. And so you can see when she's published this in the 1880s, A Century of Dishonor. And so even before the death of Sitting Bull and whatnot, it's got a number of chapters that look at various Indians, the Winnebago and some of the other East Coast and the Sioux Indians and whatnot, or not East Coast, but Eastern Indians in the East. But she looks at them all, and it's quite a good read. But she's certainly one of our early, if you will, civil rights advocate for the Native Americans. So I didn't want to leave her. I didn't want to not have a slide for her. And so again, there you go. Lots of photographs. So this is even after that, but there's lots of photographs of what the reservations did look like. There's never enough food. Again, you've got all these government organizations that are supposed to be dispersing things that are required. You know how this worked. There's not going to be enough. The quality was horrible. You can only visualize maybe they started off with good intentions, but by the time you have people, you've basically just created a gross welfare system that's not even working right. But lots of the reservations and lots of photographs that you can see, and they're in the Library of Congress. Buffalo Soldiers. You had, at the very end of the Civil War, there were six units. They eventually will be condensed into 4 units or regiments, I think. I get my terms mixed up, 2 cavalry and 2 infantry, of African-American soldiers that will go out west and work to fight Indians. For the African-American, this is an opportunity to rise in the ranks. This is now somewhere for them to go in the Army, as opposed to just being, leaving the Army. And the Buffalo Soldiers become quite famous for their skills, their ability to fight the Indians and deal with the problems of the West. And as the Indian Wars wind down, many of the Buffalo Soldiers turn around, and we find them as some of the earliest, what would the term be? There's some of the earliest, there's a word there, lost it. But there'll be some of the earliest people in charge of patrolling and policing the emerging national parks. Because, again, they know the areas, they're willing to stay and do the work, but with Yellowstone and the other parks, we actually see, there's a word there, I can't think what it is. Well, yeah, I want to say park ranger. They had called them something, but you know what I'm saying? Their job is to make sure that your animals aren't grazing on public land, and that the buffalo aren't getting off onto your land, and that if you're, those kinds of things, collect taxes and whatnot. So interesting stories about the Buffalo Soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and I think the 24th and 25th Infantry. This statue is in Leavenworth, at Fort Leavenworth, of the Buffalo Soldiers. And so there's a museum, a small museum there. Of course, the African American Museum at the Smithsonian now also has information on them. And this is from the National Museum of American History. And I think it's also maybe on loan in the African American building now. But Bridgewater, interesting story about him. Notice the date, it's 1890. Many of these guys, after the Indian Wars, and if they're not working in the parks, many of them went on and then were a part of the Spanish-American War in 1898. So we see them fighting in Cuba, some with Roosevelt, and then others continue and they go over to the Philippines. And so again, as we get to the end of the 1800s, many of these people's lives continue into the 20th century. Cowboys? You want cowboys for a few minutes? Okay. All right. So, this was titled Cowboys and Indians, and most of you probably realize, or maybe you don't, but the Cowboys and the Indians seldom ever saw each other. It would have been a super rare thing. Makes for great stories in Hollywood movies, but Cowboys seldom ever saw Indians, and vice versa. But we lump them together. And the Cowboys, the Cowboys really come along when there was that post-Civil War demand for better beef, and or just the demand for beef on the East Coast, I should say, not better beef. That really kind of comes along. But right at the beginning, right before the Civil War, we started to have cattle drives. There were lots and lots and lots of longhorn cattle in Texas. They had drifted up from the Spanish days, and again, the cows didn't stop at the Rio Grande because of borders or anything. They just wander along and made little baby cows, and the populations grew. And so the growing population in the East and the desire for beef kind of brought 1 + 1 together. And we start to see cattle drives. The first one's going to places like Sedalia, Missouri. You don't think about that very often. But going up towards wherever the railroads were. And then once you could get them on the railroads, there were famous trails. Some of you heard of the Chisholm Trail because old John Wayne and whatnot. But there were lots of different trails, and no doubt these lines are general, as you might be a mile one way or a mile the other. But you usually always stopped at the same river crossings. The cowboys, it's really, really rough life. It's very difficult. The pay is not very good. The best paid cowboy or the best paid guy on a cattle drive was typically the cook. Not the guy in charge, I mean the drover. But as far as the cook, because I mean he's important and you got to have good food, and so they were always well taken care of. He's the guy feeding you. But nonetheless, it's a very tough life. About a quarter of the cowboys were African Americans. A good quarter of them were of Hispanic descent or Mexicans, because they were. It wasn't the most desirable job, but it was a job. And so you have them, and all the equipment, much of it, the Mexicans had been using for a century. So all of the accessories that a cowboy might have had been used for generations prior to whoever was doing the driving. And a few old photographs. I know these aren't Longhorns, kind of just, I don't know my cows, but there they are. And very boring, very long. I mean, there's not a lot going on. You certainly didn't want to stampede, though, because I've read where, if these cattle stampede that direction, it's not good to be him. And I have read where after 1,000 cattle run over you, you kind of look like we would see roadkill out here. You're kind of flat and leathery. So it's kind of ugly. I can see why they would be singing. If nothing else, you're not maybe singing to the cattle, you're singing to yourself but you certainly didn't want those cattle to get spooked. And the biggest thing that might spook them was not Indians, of course, but a storm. And think about where they're going across the Great Plains, and the thunderstorms with the lightning. So touch and go. Done with the cowboys already. What brings the cowboys, if you will, the whole cattle drives to an end, was the railroads kept building further out to the west and to the southwest. People, though, increasingly wanted better beef, and Longhorn cattle are not that tasty. And so we want a cow that just hangs around in the lot and just gets fat. Eat corn, eat grain, eat grass, get fat. Tied to that will be barbed wire, which I think the guy's name was Glidden, that gets the patent for barbed wire in the 1880s. And once you can fence off and just let the cows hang out, then you can feed them and they're safe. They're not going to run off. You've got water. And so barbed wire is going to bring it into those cattle drives. I always see people out cutting barbed wire in the cowboy movies. But that's how it was. And people are willing to pay. So it's all about money. If you're willing to pay for more, we'll figure out how to get you better beef. And then there was, again, Mother Nature. In the late 1880s, there were a couple of years in which they had some of the worst winters on the Great Plains, and then no rain in the summer, and it just devastated some of these these large numbers of cattle. So, whoops, I keep pushing that, sorry. Anyway. So this is what I grew up with. And I still like watching Westerns. I just finished watching English, which is a mini-series on Paramount or Cinemax, and it's all about it's a European. It's about a woman from England who comes to the United States during the Old West. It's kind of strange, but it's got a very interesting story to it. Another one I just watched the other day is called Old Henry. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's an interesting story to it. But certainly this is what so many of us grew up with in the 50s, certainly in the 50s and the 60s. And a lot of what created the West that we see in those TV shows and the movies came about because people knew about the Indians in the East Coast, but increasingly people wanted to know what is going on out there, and you start to get writers and authors of papers and articles in, say, Harper's Weekly, which was the #1 magazine, and they start taking events out west and they started making them larger than life. Buffalo Bill, who has a very interesting story, works for the government, tracking, doing some, tracking Indians and working on some sending goods back and forth. He worked out of Fort Hays, Kansas for a while. But he eventually hears that somebody's written a story about him. Again, more of the stuff we've seen. Not quite Calamity Jane, but there's Doris Day. And who's this? Is that Brad Pitt? Is this Jesse James or something? So, got to have Doris Day because somebody like that's not going to sell many tickets. But Calamity, another interesting person to read about was Calamity Jane. And I never understood why Calamity. What kind of name is that? When I read about it, then you're like, oh, you realize that in the community, she would always run to the problem. And so if there was a calamity, she was known to go to it. If smallpox hit, she went to the people who were sick and took care of them. I always thought it sounded like, well, she must just be, she must just fall down all the time. She runs into walls or whatever. But in fact, she's the one that came to the problem. And so it's an interesting story. And then all of these people we all have interesting stories, but and they all had hard lives as kids and whatnot. She becomes an alcoholic, and this is probably what kills her. And does she have a romance with Wild Bill Hickok? Well, we definitely know they met. And I haven't checked with like Ancestry.com, but they seem to have had a daughter together who she can't take care of because she's got lots of problems, and she goes back east and is raised by all kinds of stories to read about. I don't have anything to say about Jesse James, nothing personal. The whole gunfighter thing is very interesting, and that's a whole another topic, if you will. Wild Bill Hickok, fairly well educated. Some of these people are fairly self-taught, but he writes a lot. Again, you can read a lot of his letters. A lot of it was preserved. It's not good grammar, so you struggle. You're like, oh, I know what he's saying. But some of these people, unfortunately, a lot of this was kept for us, and so we can read it. He's buried in South Dakota, or he was in Deadwood. He was in the cemetery in Deadwood. And I think they've moved him once or twice. I think he's still there. And again, interesting stories. He's an example that he shoots and kills one guy. I forget, he's down around Joplin or Springfield or Wichita or somewhere. And by the time the story gets to the East Coast, he's killed 10 men. So you can see how people are, wow, we want to know more. We want to, and so before long, he's good with it. Oh yeah, I killed 10 men. Because they like being important. We all kind of like to see ourselves. So it's interesting. There's the real Annie Oakley. When you read about what she could do, it's mind-blowing, her ability with weapons, her skill, her eyesight, her ability to hit targets. It's just hard to believe, not that she's a woman at all, just that anybody could hit the targets this lady could hit. And I assume it was real. There doesn't seem to be anybody that denies her ability. And again, she's one of these kids that by the age of 9 or 10, dad has died or whatever, and she's got to go out and feed the family. And she's an interesting person. And again, you can see, in this case, you can see she's born around 1860. Some are born earlier. So, Kit Carson's going to die about this time in history. But Deadwood Dick, Nat Love, was one of these African-American cowboys who will soon find that you can make more money by selling books about yourself than wearing yourself out as a cowboy. But these become, some of the dime novels, those early paperbacks, and people loved the stories. And so he takes on the pen name or the character of Deadwood Dick, and we have a lot of stories about himself. And this is the closing of the West, really, and that was when they opened up the Panhandle the final land rush, really, of the West in 1889. One of the real photographs. Is it the Tom Cruise, Far and Away? At the very end of the movie, they kind of film this. He's finally gone out to get stake his claim, right? Stake his claim. And then the whole Oklahoma Sooners. Not being an Oklahoma person, I can't get into all that, but I forget, they fire a cannon or something, and everybody's able to take off. And they've kind of used the range and township system, and they've created lots of sections, and you can go out and claim yours. And then there you go. We'll stop there. I kind of got going fast, but I appreciate you staying. I'm sure I missed, and I probably made scores of mistakes and missed a lot of details and people. So if you were hoping to hear about Bat Masterson or somebody, I'm sorry, but I hope you enjoyed it. The bibliography can give you some direction on some books. So, all right.
Thank you very much.
All right.